It's ding ding, two men in a ring. We put pride in your stride and a quiver in your liver. You want 'em, we've got 'em, come to you. Loud and proud, he's the biggest, he's the baddest. It's Mr. Gavin Davis on the Gavin Davis Podcast Show.
And good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gavin Davis Podcast with me and my co-host, Mr. Dave Bruff. So tonight's guest, he began his martial arts journey in 1978, training in Taekwondo before studying a wide range of martial arts and combat sports. A self-defense instructor who has worked with stunt performers and stage combat specialists throughout the world. His fight direction and action design have been featured in over 200 films, television, and theatre productions. He was a member of the Western Martial Arts Illustrated magazine's editorial board and a founding member of the Bartitsu Society. He's covered a lot of ground, folks. It's absolutely incredible, his bio. From a researcher to author to developing the Wolf system of combat movement exercises to stuntman to fight director to lecturer and professional wrestler. Me and Dave want to welcome to the podcast Mr. Tony Wolf. Tony, thank you for coming on, my friend.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that introduction. I haven't heard that stuff read out for a while. It's kind of humbling these days.
Well,
I'm a bit retired now.
Yeah, I read your bio and I was blown away by it, to be honest with you. And I hope that did you justice, that little intro. So what we're going to do, Tony, we're going to start with Bartitsu. Okay, and if you can just explain to the folks listening in what Bartitsu is and where it came from.
Absolutely, and I hope that you and your listeners will bear with me. This topic has been my great passion, my great interest, really for the best part of 20 years. I've done a lot of interviews on the subject. I've produced documentaries, I've written books, and so on. I think I'm pretty much down with delivering a précis version. If I get lost in the weeds, just yell at me and I'll try and get back on topic. I'll try and do the short version. So Bartitsu is and was an eclectic martial art and self-defense system. It was founded between the years 1898 and 1902 by an extraordinary English adventurer, an engineer, entrepreneur, innovator called Edward William Barton-Wright. Barton-Wright had traveled a lot as a young man. He had operated mining concessions in Portugal. He traveled through what were then called the Straits Settlements, which is the area around what we'd call Singapore. He was very well traveled, and during his travels, he later on professed what he described as a lifelong interest in the arts of self-defense. So as he was traveling around the world, he trained in all sorts of things. He learned boxing and fencing, la savate when he was a student in France, that's French kickboxing. The use of the stiletto, which is a weapon that's associated more with the criminal underworld than with sort of Victorian English gentlemen. And he put all of these lessons into practice, according to his own report, quite regularly in mining camp brawls and that sort of thing, or rail yard stoushes around the world. So he was, again, going by his own report, that's the only record we have, he was a pretty seasoned brawler by the time he eventually washed up in Japan. He arrived in Japan in 1895, where he was employed as a manager for the E.H. Hunter and Company industrial concern in Kobe. And there he became one of the very first Europeans in recorded history to not only observe, but actually train regularly in Japanese jujitsu. He studied the Shinden Fudoryu school with a sensei called Terajima Kunichiro. And he also said that he'd taken some lessons with Professor Jigoro Kano, who of course was famously the founder of Kodokan Judo. He trained there for about 3 years. When he returned to London, he announced almost immediately the formation of a new art of self-defense. That was his phrase, which he had decided to call Bartitsu. No great modesty. It was his own name combined with jujitsu. And he said, he coined the phrase, so it's his privilege to define it. He said that it meant self-defense in every form. And he was a man of fairly modest means, middle class. He never had any extravagant possessions or anything like that. They tended to live in a series of small flats around London. He devoted all of his time to trying to establish this new art of self-defense. But for a man with modest means in Victorian England, that meant that he had to kind of establish its social respectability, because it was this new thing which had never been seen or heard of before. And so he began writing very detailed illustrated articles, illustrated with these amazing photographs of himself and one of his co-instructors, demonstrating walking stick self-defense and umbrella self-defense, illustrating this fantastically novel secret art of Japanese wrestling, he called jujitsu, which had basically only been rumored before he went and trained and then brought this information back to England. He began performing exhibitions and lectures all about Bartitsu. And Bartitsu was not just jujitsu, it was not just savate kickboxing, it wasn't just walking stick fighting. He had this brilliant innovation. He was basically Bruce Lee 90 years ahead of his time. His innovation was, let's bring together the best and most effective aspects of all these different styles, and we'll combine them and create the ultimate gentlemanly art of self-defense. And to test it, particularly the jiu-jitsu aspect, because that was so novel, because no one in England had ever really heard of this Japanese art, he began to organize public challenge contests. And the way you do that back then was go on the music hall circuit. So the music halls were incredibly popular. Again, this is decades before radio or television or anything like that. If you wanted entertainment, you'd go into London and attend one of the grand music halls, where they would have all sorts of entertainments, songs and jugglers and acrobats and all kinds of things. He pitted his two young Japanese instructors, Yukio Tani and Sadakazu Yunishi, against champions of any European style who wanted to take them on. He stipulated they had to fight under jiu-jitsu rules, but Tani and Yunishi were frequently fighting against guys who had dwarfed them in size and weight and strength, and who were also very good wrestlers in their own specialist styles. They never lost. We've never, in 20 years of research, we've never come across a record of Tani or Yunishi ever losing under those circumstances. So that very quickly established the efficacy of Japanese martial arts in the English and then in the world popular imagination. So for about 4 gloriously interesting years, the Bartitsu Club in London, which was at number 67B Shaftesbury Avenue, it was a place to see and be seen. He brought in expert instructors in all these different disciplines. There were some quite famous politicians and athletes and others who were affiliated with the school. In mid-1902, for reasons that after 20 years of intensive research, we still don't exactly know, the club closed down. It just disappeared. Some individual people, some students who had trained at the club kind of continued it under other names. But basically, from mid-1902, that was the end of Bartitsu. And it might have been completely forgotten in history, if not for the fact that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote it into one of his Sherlock Holmes stories. In The Adventure of the Empty House, I think, he writes about this very dramatic confrontation between Sherlock Holmes and his evil arch nemesis, Professor Moriarty, which takes place on the brink of the Reichenbach waterfalls in Switzerland. Very dramatic scene. Dr. Watson comes upon the scene a little bit later. Both the men are gone, and Watson, as it turns out, incorrectly deduces that they fought and both fell to their deaths into the waterfall. A couple of years later, Conan Doyle was persuaded to bring back the Sherlock Holmes character, but then he needed some clever way to bring the Holmes character back from his apparent death. And so he wrote that Sherlock Holmes had kind of secretly also been a master of this thing which Doyle referred to as Bartitsu. He just misspelled it, which he described as the secret style of Japanese wrestling. And it was that typo happening in the midst of this very dramatic scene where it was the end of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, of course, being at that time the most popular, literally the most popular fictional character in the entire world, that kept people wondering all the way through the 20th century, what did Doyle mean by this Bartitsu? And gradually over the course of the 20th century, I guess we'll talk about that in a little bit, some researchers began to put together a few pieces of the Bartitsu puzzle. And then we came along about 20 years ago, and from that point, it's kind of accelerated. That's the very short version.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pass you on to Dave because I want to bring Dave in.
So thanks, Tony. That's great. And I'd just like to say before we start going further, you know, I've been a big fan of your research and work, and all of the research I've done in the area has been pretty much based on your extensive research, and I really appreciate the work that you've done in the field.
Thank you,
So
and you're most welcome.
So I wonder if we could just expand a little bit on that last point you made. What was your role in developing, rediscovering Bartitsu and developing that? And maybe you could then go on to describe a little bit about the Bartitsu Society and the Bartitsu Compendia and what they are.
Sure. I first came across the term Bartitsu when I was a young teenager. This would have been the early 1980s, probably. And for some reason, I was reading a Sherlock Holmes encyclopedia. I don't know why. I wasn't a big Sherlock Holmes fan, but I came across this reference, and it was a couple of pictures from Barton-Wright's article where he's demonstrating jujitsu, and just a short entry which described Bartitsu as the Victorian version of jujitsu. And I was fascinated because I'd been training in martial arts for a number of years, even by then. And I was developing this interest in kind of the unusual, the esoteric aspects of martial arts, the things that most people go, what? What's that? That was kind of my jam. That was what I became interested in. And so that one description, the Victorian version of jiu-jitsu, just fascinated me. I was like, what does that mean? What would be the Victorian version of jiu-jitsu? But for the benefit of your younger viewers and listeners, this is decades before the internet happened. And the way life worked then was you'd come across this fascinating reference to something, and then you just wonder about it for years. You might go to the local library, but there's nothing there. You can't find anything. And so you just wonder about things for years and years and years. And then eventually the internet came along. I think Bartitsu was actually probably the first internet search term I ever entered. And at that time, there wasn't much available at all. This would have been in the late 90s. But there was more available just through that internet search than I'd come across just sort of by accident over the previous years. And I joined a couple. One of the things I'd become interested in by that point is the project of reviving historical martial arts from written sources. Some of your followers may be familiar with what's called HEMA these days, Historical European Martial Arts. So that's the international effort. It's been going on for nearly 30 years now, of referring to these incredibly detailed instructional manuals, basically treatises, written by combat masters of the 1600s and the 1700s that go into all these incredibly elaborate systems of sword fighting and dagger fighting and spears, all the sorts of things that European warriors and aristocrats would have learned hundreds of years ago. And because it was all written down in such fantastic detail, illustrations and discussions about tactics and all sorts of things, there became this kind of international fascination with the idea, would it be possible to bring this stuff back and actually practice it as a functional martial art? And I became fascinated with that, partly because I was working at that time as a fight choreographer in theatre. And a lot of what I was doing was plays of William Shakespeare, which are, of course, mostly set during that period. And it would be a terrific resource for me if I could learn exactly how historical rapier and dagger masters actually fought, so that we're not just making stuff up. And my interest in Bartitsu just dovetailed right into that, because I realized we could apply the same research techniques and the same kind of pressure testing and practical experimentation techniques to Bartitsu that we'd been applying to other historical fighting styles. The big difference was that frequently with, say, 1600s rapier fencing, you can refer to these incredibly detailed, thick treatises, and as long as you translate the original language into English, you can follow the instructions pretty clearly. Bartitsu, we didn't have the book. Barton-Wright, although he said a couple of times he was going to write this, the ultimate book of Bartitsu, he never got around to it. So what we had was a series of very highly detailed technical sequences, kata, set plays, that sort of thing. A collection of, fewer than 100 of those. And they gave us a really good sense of aspects of his style. We've got a good sense of the stick fighting aspect, the Vigny walking stick and umbrella combat. Pretty good sense of the jujitsu. He didn't detail anything really in technical terms about the kickboxing aspect, but he did drop some clues and hints. And after years of research, we were able to figure out at least the gist of what that was. So a number of us who'd been interested in this stuff got together originally on a Yahoo Groups forum, which was an old listserv basically. And a colleague of mine, Will Thomas, who's a mystery author, set up basically a Bartitsu forum. That was what it was called. And it attracted the very small number of very widely scattered people who developed an interest in this esoteric subject over the years. And because we were all in different countries, we could all kind of bring not only our own martial arts expertise, but also the fact that a number of our people were in England. They could go to the British Library and do research that wasn't available to me in New Zealand and wasn't available to other enthusiasts in New York or whatever. And really quite quickly, we began to pull together just this incredible treasure trove of information. People were going to secondhand bookstores and scouring through old newspaper archives and all kinds of things. It was a very heady, very exciting period of a few years there. And we really started to learn a lot about Bartitsu. And in fact, in 2005, we learned so much that it occurred to us, we should really create an instruction manual. We should try to do what Barton-Wright said he was going to do around 1900, but never got around to it. We have enough information now that we can do that. I volunteered to edit that project. That was the first volume of the Bartitsu Compendium. And at this time, we were aware that we were very much the fringe of a fringe interest. No one in the world had ever heard of this thing called Bartitsu. Even historical martial arts, historical fencing and stuff was very esoteric. Most martial artists were not aware of this, never heard of it. And so we were having a great time. And we were kind of joking. I remember joking around 2005, what might happen if Bartitsu ever became popular? All of us imagining that would never happen until it did. In 2010, the first of the Sherlock Holmes movies starring Robert Downey Jr. came out. And you guys will remember that movie was literally the first one that represented Sherlock Holmes as basically an intellectual action hero. And there were a lot of martial arts fight scenes. This is the first time that the Sherlock Holmes character had ever been closely associated with martial arts on a mass scale. And almost literally overnight, hits on our little Wikipedia Bartitsu page went up over 800%. I watched that happen in real time. And all of a sudden, we were getting all of this attention, and people would say, what's this Bartitsu? And lots of newspaper and TV articles. Again, a very exciting time. The practical problem for us, though, was that we were still this really small, esoteric bunch of people scattered around several different countries. Some of us by that time were teaching basic Bartitsu seminars and that kind of thing. But typically at intensives, at martial arts conferences and that kind of thing. There may have been one ongoing course by that point, but not many. And all that attention circa 2010, 2014, that sort of period. It was both a blessing and a curse, I would say. It was thrilling that our tiny little fringe interest was suddenly this sort of minor pop culture phenomenon that it became. And again, all of a sudden, Bartitsu was being written into video games and movies and TV shows and graphic novels and all sorts of things. So that was cool and fun at the cultural level. It was gratifying to us because we had been pretty much resigned to Barton-Wright and all of his innovations just always being this tiny little footnote of martial arts history. So the fact that it was suddenly back on the pop culture map, that was a cool thing for us. But it was also, all that exposure was also a challenge because, as I say, there were only a few of us around the world who had pursued this thing as instructors. Many people would kind of dabble in it. Many people had more or less an academic interest, but there are, I don't know, maybe at that time, 10 instructors. The thing with the Bartitsu Society was we never set up as a kind of traditional martial arts association with ranks and hierarchies and that sort of thing. It had occurred to us early on that we could, but it particularly occurred to me that the moment you do that, you open yourself up for politics. And I'd already experienced more than enough martial arts politics in my previous training. And so I thought, well, what would happen? I think it would be better if we at least delay that process, allow this thing to be this kind of anarchic, eclectic, do your own thing practice, so that the Bartitsu Society is there to provide all the resources in the world. All of our information just gets put straight out there basically for nothing, which will hopefully inspire lots of people with different training backgrounds to get together and experiment with it and pressure test it and spar and try and figure out what this Bartitsu thing was, which was always one of my strongest motivations. What was this thing that Barton-Wright was talking about? Because essentially it was a kind of a historical mystery box at that point. But we kind of figured if you get enough people all over the world experimenting with it, then there'll be a consensus. And it's like, okay, we think this is what he was actually talking about. We've tested it. That's where it is. And that, I would say that did happen, but that took a long time. The pop culture interest eventually died away, sort of 2015, 2016. And those of us who were still seriously interested kept going, to the point that I felt around about 2018, I had a really good handle on this stuff. I'd been teaching it for years by then all over the world, and then intensively at a martial arts school in Chicago for several years. I felt I had a very good sense of how the style worked tactically, technically. There was almost literally nothing left to learn about it, either historically or culturally or technically. So at that point, I personally felt that it was probably time to hang up my straw boater hat and move on to other things.
See, I'm a personal believer in hybrid systems anyway, taking the best from all martial arts and putting them into one. How did you find that with all this research that went into your Bartitsu and this teaching and instructing, everything that you went through, how did you find that impacted on the way you trained and practiced martial arts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it was a two-way street. Like I said, Bartitsu, what we had with Bartitsu was not a complete technical catalog. I wish, all of us wish that Barton-Wright had written his big book of Bartitsu, but he didn't. So it's this mystery box. And that means you've got to get kind of creative with it. You've got to read between the lines. You've got to figure out, okay, these things are common to this style, and you can compare it to that similar system that was happening around the same time. And this instructor at the Bartitsu Club, Pierre Vigny, he had his own very sort of idiosyncratic method of stick fighting, which was different from the Lacan that was being taught throughout France in these particular ways. It was all, it wasn't a matter of simply putting together a straightforward curriculum. For me, it was a matter of figuring out the right way to train so that you would end up performing something that was as close as damn it to what we understand was actually happening at the Bartitsu Club at that time. And for me, that was a process that I think of as combat improvisation. This is going to be, it's a little difficult to explain. If we were in the same room, I could show you because you're both martial artists, but essentially the way I taught it was not so much technique by technique or kata by kata, but I referred everything back to a set of basic combat and movement principles. I taught a series of exercises initially that were simply intended to teach those principles as skills of body movement. Then, once people have mastered these basic skills, things like, you could think of it as synergy, which is the ability to use tactile senses to sense where another person is shifting their weight, where they're tensing their muscles, that sort of thing. Alignment, which is simply moving and standing in effective balance. Extension, which is the way you manage momentum of a walking stick or a foot or a fist, doesn't matter much. There's a set of about 7 basic principles. So I put all of my students through a training course in those 7 principles, through a whole series of games and exercises that I've been working out for years. At that point, we start to introduce the canonical material, the stuff that we know for a fact Barton-Wright and his colleagues were promoting as Bartitsu around about 1900. So we start looking at all the very formal set plays and the silly stuff, standing with a walking stick like this, and figuring out, okay, exactly what does this tactic, this technique imply for a larger style. But we don't stop there, because as Barton-Wright himself said, the premise here is not to sort of make the other guy do what you want. It's to be able to respond effectively to whatever it is he does. And so once we'd learned all of the very formal stylized jujitsu and kickboxing and stick fighting set plays that have been recorded, then we broke them. And then we made an exercise, for example, okay, we're going to begin the kata, we're going to begin the set sparring, that sort of thing. And then the attacker's role is to do something unexpected. And so the defender has to improvise around that and figure out another way to take control of the situation. And then the more of those exercises you do, and the more of the canonical material you study meticulously, so you've got this kind of interesting blend between rock-ribbed historical technical accuracy on the one hand, and a very freestyle improvisational approach to training on the other. At that point, once you start to combine those two, the students' improvisations start to blend straight back into the formal set play and into the kata and into what we know Bartitsu was. And then we use those exercises as a bridge between learning formal waza and formal kata through into free sparring, which I always figured was sort of the ultimate test of the style. I figured if myself, and especially if my students, could fight effectively in the style that's very, very closely evocative of what we know exactly they were doing at the Bartitsu Club, then that was it. That would prove whether the style worked or not. And that was my major curiosity. It was my major reason for pursuing this over the years. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah.
I mean, there's tons of questions coming off that, Tony. I'm going to stick to the schedule. I just want to say, I get a real sense of your excitement from that period. You know, when it was coming to light, and as a researcher, I feel I really wish I'd been involved in that, because it must have been such an exciting period. I want to talk about.
Oh, it was in a sense, it was a very romantic period.
Yeah.
A lot of imagination and a lot of hard work.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing. Talking about Yaneshi and Tani, who really post Bartitsu exploded the jiu-jitsu in the West. What do you think judo and jiu-jitsu in the West would look like had Barton-Wright not taken those guys over, or had Barton-Wright not visited Japan? What do you think it would look like today?
I think it would look the same, because if he didn't do it, somebody else would have. He just happened to do it first, and that, from our point of view, that does make quite a difference. Yeah, well, Barton-Wright, I was talking before about his music hall exhibitions. This was literally the first time anyone in the Western world, anyone on a sort of a mass scale, had been exposed to Japanese martial arts. There had been literally one academic exhibition of jiu-jitsu in England prior to Barton-Wright's work. And only a small number of people actually witnessed that. So Barton-Wright, in bringing Tani and Yaneshi onto the music hall stages, and they were both very slight, very small, and very young men at this time, 19 and 20 years old. They were both very athletic as well, but in their gi, they looked like two, stereotypically small, slender Japanese men. And the spectacle of these huge European wrestlers, not only wrestlers, but other athletes as well, getting up on the stage night after night after night and just being toppled like dominoes. They would, the Japanese wrestlers would toss them all over the place. They'd submit them basically at will, because what they were introducing was this incredibly novel idea of submission wrestling. That was unheard of. And it was also very controversial at the time. A lot of in fact, almost literally all of the British wrestling establishment turned their backs on the whole thing. Barton-Wright was desperate to get some of the top champions, the top heavyweight champion wrestlers in the English styles, Greco-Roman, or it's French, but Cumberland, Westmoreland, and the various regional wrestling styles. He really, really wanted to get the top, heaviest guys on stage against Tanya and Yanishi. And they all balked at that idea because it was obvious they would have lost. And so there was no real benefit to the champions in taking on these two young Japanese guys in a style they were completely unfamiliar with. It was very controversial. There were vehement arguments back and forth, both on the music hall stage. Barton-Wright was always being heckled by people, and also through the letters to the editor comments in columns in sporting newspapers at the time. The arguments got really heated, just about to the point of violence a few times. But the net effect of all of that was that it, with quite a splash, introduced the idea not only of jiu-jitsu, but the concept of submission wrestling to the Western world, just within the period of about 6 months, because that was the period that he was touring the music halls. Like I say, if he hadn't done that, then maybe a few years later, somebody else certainly would have. As it happened, it was Barton-Wright and Bartitsu in London, circa 1900. That was when that happened.
So that's, I mean, and that's a really exciting period, that the Bartitsu period, and then immediately the martial arts development after that, with some great characters, Tony. Is there anyone that you find particularly interesting or a favorite protagonist of that era?
I mean, it really has to be Barton-Wright for me. I've been studying the guy's life for 20 years. And sometimes people ask me why, and I originally couldn't answer that question. I asked my wife. She thought that it was because I identified very strongly with Barton-Wright. And that took me aback for a moment, because he did not have a very happy life. I would say that Edward Barton-Wright's peak was his experience with Bartitsu. After that, he almost turned his back on the whole thing. The reason why the Bartitsu Club closed down, we still don't really know. The likeliest answer, and I can say this with some authority after 20 years of research, is simply that he was too far ahead of his time. He was promoting, for example, a combination of jiu-jitsu, stick fighting, and kickboxing in a culture in which, if he'd exhibited Bartitsu, let's say, as a sport, he would probably have been literally thrown in jail for brawling in a public place. There were no laws to support that combination being exhibited as a public sport. There was no circuit for submission wrestling, because he was inventing it all as he went. So what tended to happen was athletes who had already trained in any of the fencing or boxing or jiu-jitsu or stick fighting, well, not so much jiu-jitsu, but stick fighting, would go to the Bartitsu Club. They'd train intensively for maybe a year, maybe 2 years. They would have picked up, but in that time, all of the supplementary skills that they were interested in. And then basically they would just all go off and do their own things. And that left Barton-Wright about midway through 1902, really without a community to support his efforts anymore. The people who had joined the Bartitsu Club because it was sort of a new craze and it was interesting, their curiosity had been satisfied by that time. They were on to the next craze. And there was no infrastructure, there was no support system. And I think he recognized that. He just said, okay, I've now done this, I'm going to move on to something else. But really the rest of his life wasn't very happy. So when my wife said I identified with him, it took me aback a little bit. But I think she was right. I think that I identify with him during that period because I like to think of myself as an imaginative person, as a bit of not really an entrepreneur, but as an innovator, possibly as someone who's a bit ahead of my time in a few ways. And Barton-Wright was just this extraordinary example of that, this very specific time and place. Like I say, he was kind of Bruce Lee, but 90 years too early.
That's I've to be fair, I've got about 1,000 questions, Tony, to be fair, of what you've already gone through. Dave, I think you're the same, aren't you? I feel a little bit like you touched on politics a little bit, and you touched on the fact that a lot of the submission wrestlers weren't able to compete with what they were doing in the in the actual grappling style that they were doing with the jiu-jitsu. Were they, obviously we know the Brazilians got hold of the jiu-jitsu and then they ran with it with regard to the floor work. When they closed down in 1902, there's a gap there in what I would class as British jiu-jitsu up until probably the 50s and the 60s. What, in that period, was the jiu-jitsu very self-defense orientated stand-up, or was it grappling based, which then obviously we would refer to as judo? Because I feel we're missing a period there where the development of the grappling was missed in the UK.
I can talk about that up until sort of the early 1920s, but
Okay.
my knowledge of the 30s and 40s, you guys probably know better than I do.
Okay.
It's a bit complicated, really. The Bartitsu Club was kind of the spark. After that, a number of Barton-wright's senior students, or the senior students of the club, I should say, joined up with Tani and Yunishi. Our impression is that Yukio Tani and Sadakazu Yunishi didn't like each other very much. They almost literally had nothing to do with each other after the Bartitsu Club period. They both set up their own schools. They, I think, only ever once collaborated on a public exhibition or anything like that. And just reading between the lines, it seems like those two didn't get on. But they both set up pretty successful schools. Yunishi's was the Golden Square Dojo. And Yunishi actually joined forces with another instructor, Taro Miyake, who was a heavyweight. Tani and Yunishi were lightweights. Miyake was a heavyweight. And they set up a pretty successful school for a while too. And so between the Bartitsu Club and those two dojo, there was enough that it trained up a next generation. What happened to those guys? I would say a number of them who didn't previously have a wrestling background did tend to specialize in stand-up self-defense. I would say that, and I've never really thought about this aspect before you asked the question, I think that the newaza, the ground technique, the sort of the innovations of submission wrestling and grappling would pretty quickly have become focused at the Budokai in London, where Tani became an instructor.
Right.
And because that was very much, an ongoing school, it wasn't just kind of a short-term course or somebody writing a book or an article. That went on for years, and he was an instructor there for years. I think by that time you're getting into the Trevor Leggett's and those sorts of people. And the link there was simply that Tani, who had taught at Bartitsu Club, continued teaching right the way, well, for as long as he could. He was debilitated by a stroke, unfortunately, when he was still fairly young. But yeah, I would say that the competitive aspect, the ground fighting, the grappling, pretty around when the Budokai was set up in 1918, I think. That became the center for that activity in the UK.
Okay. Is Dave, anything you want to cover on that little section before we move on, mate?
Yeah, just to comment, I think jiu-jitsu during that period in the UK, it seemed to be quite eclectic, particularly after Yaneshi and Tani Miyake's schools, and you start to see judo becoming the main practiced form of jiu-jitsu in the UK. And I think the terms jiu-jitsu and judo were used interchangeably. People were doing judo but calling it jiu-jitsu. Whereas in Brazil, with the submission going on in Brazil, I think it was pretty much judo until much later on when I can't remember which Gracie it was.
Carlson.
It became kind of defined as its own separate form of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, it's not widely known, but Mitsuya Maeda, before he arrived in America and then went to Brazil, he actually competed on the same circuit in England as Taro Miyake and Sadakazu Yunishi and Tani did.
Yeah, we had Robert Drysdale on the podcast a while ago, and I'm in the process of reading his book. And he was saying that when Elio and Carlos originally picked up what Maeda was teaching, they were teaching and learning judo. And then as time progressed, when Carlson got hold of it in the 60s, obviously the rule set changed, and then they developed into what we would class today as modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is an interesting historical note there that goes right back to prior to the Bartitsu Club, which is the question of where Tani and Yanishi and the other first generation of instructors who taught and competed in the West, where they actually learned their really quite innovative ground wrestling style from. And we actually isolated that. This was a long time ago now. This was around 2007, 2008, I think. Myself and another couple of researchers. And we traced it to the Handa school, the Handa dojo in Osaka. There's a connection there, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to cite names. It's been so long since I've thought about this. But there was a connection between Yataro Handa and I should be able to remember the name. It's just gone out of my head. But one of the great innovators in Jiu-Jitsu Newaza at that time. You guys might remember the name.
Matteo Montanelli. Matteo
Yes,
Montanelli.
Yeah. One of them was the other's senior. The suggestion is that the Handa dojo in Osaka, although it was formally dedicated to a particular Koryu school of Jiu-Jitsu, informally it seems to have become a headquarters for this very innovative, sort of eclectic, multidisciplinary style of ground fighting. All of the Bartitsu Club principles, and I think literally all of the first generation, or the next generation of Japanese instructors who toured through competing in the musicals, they were all connected to that particular dojo during the very late 19th century. So my very, very strong suspicion is that if researchers look more closely at the Handa dojo, they're going to get a much stronger sense of exactly how that innovative style was spread around the world.
I've got a comment and then a question for you, Tony. So my comment is that the author, I'm sure you're familiar with Roberto Pedreira's work on the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He actually cites, in I think the appendix of the second volume, Tani and Miyake's The Game of Jiu-Jitsu as one of the founding texts of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was
I didn't know that, but
it was popular in Brazil early on, and it seems that a lot of the techniques are basically founding principles of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But my question...
I didn't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. I mean, it's a terrific book. Even if you read it now, it's still, it's very relevant to modern practice. My question for you, Tony, is what was Barton-Wright's connection with the Handa dojo? How did he get Tani and Yaneshi via Osaka? We
don't know. He wrote so little about that. All that he wrote about his own training in Japan was that he had trained with a sensei in Kobe who specialized in the kata form of instruction. That's the verbatim quote. And that he had taken some lessons with Professor Jigoro Kano of Tokyo. That's it. When he was originally bringing the Japanese instructors over from Japan, which was quite a big deal in those days, he said that he had corresponded with Professor Kano and with other friends in Japan to arrange for the people to travel over. Now, that was always a bit of a puzzle to us, because you'd think if he was corresponding with Jigoro Kano, then Kano would send over judoka, representatives of the Kodokan. And none of the originally 3 guys who were sent over had any real connection with the Kodokan. So we don't know what happened there, basically. The only connection between Barton-Wright and Osaka that we can conjecture is that Kobe and Osaka are very close to each other geographically. So we sort of hypothesize that he may literally have just asked around members of his dojo in Japan, explained that he wanted people to come over and not only teach jiu-jitsu, but also to compete against Westerners. And then that the local people, the local jiu-jitsuka in Kobe and Osaka might have said, well, we should get people from the Handa dojo because they're all experts at competitive wrestling, ground fighting. That's conjecture on my part. I think it's pretty well-informed conjecture. But that's literally everything that we know based on what Barton-Wright wrote.
Okay. What do you feel the future is for Bartitsu, Tony?
I would have had a very different question like 15 years ago. I think it is apt to just continue as it has been, as this kind of niche interest, curiosity. There are sometimes efforts, there have been over the past 20 years, there have been efforts to turn it into a modern self-defense system. I think, with all due respect, that's short-sighted. There are plenty of modern self-defense systems. It used to call, I don't even know if this is still current jargon, but it used to be reality-based self-defense. Mm. There are hundreds of those that already exist in the world. I don't see the point of reinventing those wheels while wearing top hats. Yeah, I just don't get why that would be useful. To my mind, and this is after, again, 20 years of watching various revivalist efforts and reconstruction efforts, really putting a great deal of myself, my time and money and everything else into this as a passion. The greatest strength of Bartitsu is as it was. It is to figure out exactly, as close to exactly as you can, what these guys were doing, these particular men, these particular personalities at this very specific time and place. Figure out what they were doing. And then if you're interested, for whatever personal reason, then you try to fight as well as they did. And that's, to me, that's the ultimate purpose of Bartitsu. Right now, I'd say it's going through a lull. The Bartitsu scene's going through a lull. Partly still because of COVID. Even at its height, there were maybe 50 Bartitsu clubs scattered around the world. And a lot of them only last a short time. You know, people get in, they'll explore with it, they'll experiment, they'll have some fun with it, they'll learn a bit, and then they'll move on to something else. As far as I'm concerned, that's fine. That's the way it always was. I suspect that it's just going to continue like that. In another 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, someone like me will come along and they will find the books that I edited and the documentaries and all of this information, and they'll say, wow, that's amazing. Let's bring that back again. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Just as we did with Barton-Wright. And hopefully that's just going to keep on continuing, forever.
So you've just published the third Bartitsu compendium, and it's a huge amount of information and research, the three compendia together.
Yeah.
Do you think you've exhausted all the research in that area now? Is there more to do, and are you continuing to research? What's next for you, Tony?
Those are two very separate questions. Yes, the answer to the first question is yes. I devoted just an unhealthy amount of time to this interest over 20 years. I literally dreamed about discovering, the lost diary of Barton-Wright. I went through this in writing the introduction to the Compendium, Volume 3. I have stood at the brink of the Reichenbach waterfall where Sherlock Holmes notionally fought with Professor Moriarty. I've taught Bartitsu in many different countries to a fascinating diversity of people. I've taught it in an Australian university and in a castle in Italy as eagles wheeled overhead, a circus school in Seattle. It's taken me all over the place, and I've had some terrific experiences with it. The answer is, I think at this stage, there's nothing left for me to learn about it. In fact, I felt that a number of years ago, probably the best part of 10 years ago. I wrote the third volume of the compendium, edited it, but also wrote a great deal of that one. Really in response to a catastrophic technical disaster that happened to the Bartitsu Society website. In 2019, just through a simple miscommunication between myself and one of the other administrators, something that had been overlooked, the entire Bartitsu website crashed and couldn't be revived. And that was well over 10 years of cutting edge research and, instructional videos, all kinds of things, just completely gone. And that was hard. It was a hard thing to deal with. And so I sort of spearheaded the effort to bring that back, to reconstruct it. At the same time, it really underscored the fragility of electronic media. I'd spent so much time creating material and doing research and so on for that website, and it's gone. And so really my reason for spending so much more time on the compendium, which is a 600 and something page book, 647 pages, I think, is that it's a physical medium, and there can be copies of that book on people's shelves, and there can be copies of that book in the library. And so if the worst comes to the worst, in 100 years' time, another guy like me comes along and wants to make use of all this research and stuff we put together, they will at least have these 3 big, thick books that'll help them along their way. You also asked what's next for me. What's next for me is so completely irrelevant to martial arts or Bartitsu or anything else that it would be a whole different discussion. I'm pretty much a retired martial artist. I'm comfortable saying that these days. I'm 56 years old. My driving passions and interests have moved on from the antagonistic esoterica of Edwardian London. And I had a really good time with it. I met a lot of cool people. I learned what I wanted to learn. And I look forward to maybe helping to guide a bit the next generation, whenever that comes along.
Yeah, I think what we'll look at doing, Dave, if we can get links to Tony's work and the documentaries that you've been involved in, Tony, and we can post them with the podcast when it goes up on YouTube, so
sure.
people listening can actually, if they want to read up any more or watch you work on the documentaries that you've done, then they've got access to that straight away. Yeah,
my pleasure. I'll email those to you straight after.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. I've got some questions for you on professional wrestling.
Okay.
How did you get into that? And
how
go on.
I mean, I got into that. I was teaching something. I can't even remember what now. It was just so long ago. It would have been stunt fighting or martial arts or a stage combat or something, at this glorious old school, really, really old school 1920s vintage gym in a suburb of Wellington, New Zealand called Kilburnie. And I'd be finishing up teaching my classes on Saturday mornings. This is a whole anecdote, feel free to cut it down or something, but it's quite fun. I'd finish up teaching my classes on Saturday mornings. As we were finishing up, these giants would come walking in. And I recognized some of them from watching a 1970s New Zealand TV series called On the Mat, which is this weekly pro wrestling show. And I recognized some of these guys coming in. I'd been a kid watching the show, and these were sort of like these were the all-stars. Yeah, they were a bit older by then. And I figured out, okay, I stayed around after one of my sessions once. Okay, they're bringing back pro wrestling. This is just at the time the WWF, it was then WWE now, was first becoming popular. The Superstars of Wrestling show was taking off in pop culture.
Yeah.
So it would have been like the late 80s, I guess, late 80s. And at that time, I was doing stunt work and I was working as a fight choreographer. And I thought pro wrestling would be an amazing thing to add to my skill set. And so I went up to one of the guys and I said, look, can I have a pretty extensive martial arts background. I'm an acrobat, could I do this? And he took a look at me and said, oh, no, mate, you're too small. No, we need much bigger guys for this game. No. I said, okay, fair enough. But then to me, it becomes like the Shaolin temple thing where the monk says, no, and you wait in the garden until they say yes. So the next week I approached him again and said, look, I'd be really keen, I'm not in bad shape and stuff. I did that a couple of times. Eventually he says, yeah, okay, all right, we'll give you a go. We'll give you an audition. He says, Sangha, come over here, mate. Over walks Chief Sangha. Yes, boss. He says, Chief Sangha, a Samoan Matai, tribal chief. My height in both directions. Just a massive man. Yes, boss, what do you want? The guy says, oh, this young fellow reckons he wants to be a pro wrestler. So let's test him. All right, boss. So Sangha goes down into the referee's position, which is basically on all fours in a completely posted, braced stance. And the guy says, okay, have a go, flip him over. It's like, that's the challenge. If you can flip him over, then you get to be a pro wrestler. I thought, okay. So I jumped on him, and it's like wrestling with the back end of a pickup truck. He's not only enormous, but he was also a very, very good amateur wrestler. And he was countering everything. I was trying all sorts of dirty wrestling and hair grabs and stuff, and everyone's laughing at me. Until, in a moment of sheer insanity, I basically jumped onto his neck, which is it's a crazy move. It made no sense. I jumped onto his neck so that my legs were sort of wrapped underneath his arms. At exactly that moment, he shifted his weight in such a way that my doing this unexpected move flipped him over neatly, and he's laying flat on his back like a turtle. Pure accident on my part. But to everybody watching, it looked like I'd pulled off the most incredible wrestling throw that anyone's ever seen. And then we're all coming up, patting me on the back and saying, oh, all right, welcome aboard, mate. We could use someone with your talent. And so I spent the next several years traveling around New Zealand, wrestling as the Canadian Wolverine. That was my real name. With a fake Canadian accent and everything.
The history of pro wrestling is quite an interesting one. Because I was watching a documentary and they're saying that obviously the shoot fights originally started going on quite long. And then during, let's say, the 20s, 30s, people were starting to lose interest in some of the fights because they were going on for some fights were going on for an hour. So what they did, they started, instead of doing shoot fights, they started actually working the matches, which was the beginning of the pro wrestling. And then obviously you got to the Gorgeous George era and so on to what it is today. It's evolved massively. But it's interesting where it comes from and how it evolved.
Yeah, it is. It's a fascinating study. And the thing is, in New Zealand in the late 80s, early 90s, I caught the very tail end of that old school British blue collar pro wrestling tradition. We didn't rehearse our matches. We got out there and improvised. And for some people, it became really quite competitive. And, we're there to do a show. But basically what I compare it to, like when I'm describing this to actors and acting students, I say it's like doing improv, except you're doing it acrobatically and really, really fast. And there's actual danger involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the tradition that we inherited, which is the Gorgeous George and the Jackie Pallo era of pro wrestling.
Yeah.
I was at the absolute tail end of that in New Zealand. And then the next generation after me, they were much more influenced by the WWF, and things were much more, as it were, choreographed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last question on the subject before I pass you back on to Dave.
Sure.
You've been a martial artist for, since 1978, so over 45 years. Was there more toll on your body doing martial arts or the professional wrestling you did for a few years?
Oh, man, I have been so lucky regarding injuries. I've had the luck of the devil. I've worked as a stuntman, a professional wrestler, full contact self-defense instructor, so that's getting hit all the time. Martial artist, sparring, let alone the stuff I get up to, in my free time. No, not one serious injury ever.
Oh, you've been lucky then, because as I say, the toll that it takes to be a professional wrestler from the stuff I watch, the documentaries I watch, is incredible.
Yeah, no, this is the thing. People stay in that game way too long. I was in it for about 3 years.
Right.
And I had a lot of fun, and I made some money, and I toured around, and that was cool. And then I got out. Guys who were in that, especially in the US, it's a whole different ballgame over here. I should mention to your listeners, in case they didn't pick it up, I'm originally from New Zealand, but I've been living in Chicago and the US for 17 years or so. The guys who make it their entire lives, they do make money, but just at a catastrophic toll to their lives and their health. Would not recommend it.
Dave, is there any topics and questions you got for Tony before we start bringing the podcast to a close, mate?
I think I think, Gav, and if it's all right with you, Tony, I think there's so much we can follow up on. I think what we should do is digest this, and then maybe you can come on again and we can follow up with some of the insights that you've raised there with us. because it really is a fascinating subject and there is so much to discuss. But I think we should probably bring this one to a close, given the time we've taken of Tony's already.
Okay,
Yeah,
no worries.
that would be my pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will send you after this an email with links to various books and documentaries and stuff, and hope a few people enjoy that. And yeah, it would be a great pleasure to come back and talk again. I haven't actually talked on the subject for quite a while. I used to do a bunch of interviews about this, but it's been a few years now.
Well, Tony, it's been a pleasure having you on, mate. Your dedication to not only Bartitsu, but martial arts in general is absolutely amazing. Your work ethic and everything that's gone into it. Dave, as I said, thank you earlier. I thank you as well. Thank you for being a leader on these topics, because, as I say, the next generation are going to really, really digest this and take it forward. So it's absolutely amazing what you've done.
I hope so, and thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Thank you for your time, Tony. Good night, everyone.